What links President Trump, Jeffrey Epstein, Black Power radicals, the Clintons, and Kanye West? This story begins amid the tumult of 1960s America. Black and left-wing critics' long-standing grudge against the American government's exercise of power dates back to the Civil Rights era, and the irresistible demand for black human rights. State involvement in the deaths of Fred Hampton, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and many other black resistance leaders decapitated the post-war black human rights movement. The assassinations also removed from the world's television screens gifted men and women with compelling evidence that the emerging American global business empire was not an obvious force for human good. The Cointelpro program of planned killings and disruption was followed by the flooding of black ghettos with heroin and cocaine in the 1970s and 80s. Black and left-wing sympathizers still believe claims that the government was at the heart of this wickedness. They also despise the mass media, which during the 80s crack epidemic, was deployed to portray blacks, not as a deliberately maligned group, but as simply criminogenic. The media willingly played its role, helping to remove any lingering white sympathy for the plight of the black masses. At the same time, the media's work dovetailed neatly with a slew of research from think tanks and respected academics, such as Charles Murray. His influential bell curve study gave credence to controversial anti-black views that had been hidden for a generation. Murray was pivotal to establishing the idea that innate differences and deficiencies explained why blacks were not progressing, despite massive government intervention and welfare support. Surely, the data proved that it was pointless to continue with government social engineering, which aimed to produce a fairer society. By the 1990s, mass incarceration was a back-to-the-future government solution to America's rising wealth gap, the country's surging black unemployment pandemic, and black threats of inclusion or protest. During enslavement, blacks were a permanent underclass, denied basic democratic and human rights. Now labeled criminals, these designated super predators could once again be forgotten and confined to the margins of society. And who would dare claim that the government's repression camouflaged its anti-blackness? After all, there was a cross-racial consensus to cage forever these dangerous criminals. Social welfare cuts were the final act of vengeance, aimed at impoverished communities, marked by race, education and class, and stigmatized as undeserving others. Black and left-wing radicals claimed the government's crime sheet was long and detailed. When they added serial acts of state deception, such as the Iran-Contra affair, the invasion of Grenada, and claims that Iraq held weapons of mass destruction, to genuine proof of the government's anti-blackness, black and left-wing sympathizers were even more convinced of the government's calumny. So, of course, the left ate up faster than a gourmet meal every allegation of government responsibility in 21st century mega-crises, like 9/11, the arming of Osama bin Laden, the long fight with Saddam Hussein, death sanctions against the Iraqi people, and the Katrina floods. Meanwhile, over time, right-wing critics began to share the left's suspicion about the government's abuse of its power. The right analyzed the government's response to the race crises of the 1950s and 60s, but disagreed that state agencies had needlessly slaughtered leading black citizens. However, right-wing critics did conclude that the civil rights era was a dangerous departure from the norm. Civil rights was proof that the government had failed the country's white people. The right focused increasingly on the federal government's disregard for states' jurisdiction, and the imposition of bitterly contested civil rights legislation in key areas, such as education, housing and employment. Right-wing critics were careful to see the ballooning budget deficit, not as an indictment of the American war machine and pork barrel politics, but as evidence of the wastefulness of government investment in social programs aimed at undeserving minorities. The right attacked positive discrimination, racial quotas, inclusivity promotions, and any measure which challenged whites' built-in advantages. Cleverly, Right-wing advocates said they endorsed Martin Luther King's vision of a meritocracy, believing that the color-blind world that King had called for in August 1963 would end up serving the interests of America's existing racial hierarchy. The right was successful in persuading white voters to see the government's betrayal in anything which tried to redress centuries of racial disadvantage. Whites would riot at the ballot box to protest against the government's broken contract with its people. Richard Nixon's infamous Southern strategy was based on this simple idea. Nixon skillfully linked black crime to black democratic ineligibility. Nixon and his political heirs built their electoral successes on ramming home the view that whites were the only ones who deserved the government's generosity. The Southern strategy commanded whites to vote as an anti-black ethnic bloc. This ensured that George Wallace-style, Dixiecrat, white ethno-nationalism, which had been pilloried during the Civil Rights era, was once again a decisive force in American politics. Under this banner, generations of white politicians would go on to claim power at every level of government across the United States. The supposedly liberal Democrat Bill Clinton recognized the centrality of ethno-nationalism to America's politics in his 1992 and 1996 election campaigns. Clinton made sure that the Republicans would not be able to condemn him as soft on crime. Nor could his opponents outdo Clinton's zeal for imposing swingeing welfare cuts. Within 30 years, the government had moved from Johnson's Great Society to a society which readily embraced mass incarceration. By every measure, black progress had stalled by the 1990s, but still the right convinced voters that the government was giving in to diversity, abandoning its own people, and was now controlled by un-American forces. True to form, the right blamed everything it did not like on the sinister Bilderberg Group and the Illuminati, code words for the fabled Jewish world takeover of business, finance and media. Right-wing anti-government critics became ever more vocal. Membership of private gun clubs and militias flourished, as did votes for political outsiders who campaigned to limit Washington's reach. The government was accused of being too liberal, too powerful, too intrusive, and yes, too Jewish. The right wing's anti-government rhetoric became so virulent that the government itself came under attack. Right-wing terrorism was suddenly more threatening to the state than left-wing subversion, after the appalling horrors of the Oklahoma bombing. Then came the election of President Barack Obama in 2008. The right lost its mind. Obama's victory was the sum of all right-wing fears. And who, opponents asked, had made possible this success? A cabal of prominent Wall Street financiers, Jewish politicians, and Madison Avenue spin doctors, of course. The right wing collectively vowed to resist anything that would allow Obama to reset the country's racial priorities. Almost immediately, Donald Trump, then only a prominent businessman, challenged Obama's legitimacy as America's president. A small fortune was invested in proving that Obama was not an American citizen. If he was an illegitimate president, as Trump maintained, then Obama must be a dangerous imposter, set up by the globalist New World Order to dupe the nation. Trump's birther movement was the poisonous fruit of a now permanent right-wing fury that remained suspicious of government and resentful of any sign of black progress. Once unleashed into the American body politic, birtherist contempt and right-wing rage seeped into conspiracies attacking Hillary Clinton's 2016 presidential candidacy, and of course, the dismay surrounding the COVID pandemic vaccine and other such controversies. This intense outrage, which deepens with every election cycle, has spilled out into the open once again, in response to the Trump administration's desperate efforts to move on from the death of Jeffrey Epstein. The 2019 prison death of the disgraced financier, convicted teen abuser and suspected Israeli agent, was immediately challenged by right-wing sympathizers. They saw a plot to protect well-known business, political and entertainment personalities, who might have been compromised by their acceptance of Epstein's hospitality. Right-wing critics are incensed that their champion, President Donald Trump, has dismissed as a hoax their long-held theories about Epstein. Worse, key government officials want to sideline demands for complete transparency in the Epstein case, and the public disclosure of all facts related to his demise. Now the most zealous among the right wing claim that Donald Trump has been captured by the deep state. The president has betrayed his base, they argue. And so, this is where we are in 2025. The long-term effects of America's racial contagion have brought about a rare alliance between the left and right. American politics is as polarized as it has ever been in nearly 2 centuries, and yet, an ingrained suspicion of government, a fierce sense of betrayal and the primacy of race in America's story, are the only points on which both left and right can agree.